A woman knelt in the middle of a public square while a female officer filmed her on a phone, laughing. There was no warrant. There was no charge. Within minutes, her long hair was shaved off in front of dozens of onlookers. The white officer standing over her sneered, "Now you look like what you really are." The woman did not cry. She did not fight back. She simply picked up the scarf that had fallen from her head, looked him straight in the eye, and said one sentence. "I hope tomorrow morning you still have the courage to look at me." Less than 24 hours later, that same woman walked up to the judge's bench. Nobody in the small, tired neighborhood of Millbrook Heights knew her name. She wore faded jeans and an old canvas jacket with a tear at the elbow. Her sneakers were scuffed at the toes. She carried a clipboard and a canvas tote bag, and she moved through the cracked sidewalks like someone who belonged there, stopping to talk to an elderly man, watering his porch plants, crouching to pet a stray dog that trotted alongside a group of children. She asked questions gently. "How is the water pressure this month? Has anyone come to fix the street light on the corner? Has anyone from the police department been by lately? And if so, what happened?" People assumed she was a volunteer, maybe from a nonprofit, maybe a graduate student doing field work. Nobody imagined she carried a badge of her own, tucked away and unused, back home in a drawer. Her name was Amara Brooks. 42 years old, sharp-eyed, quiet in her movements, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said little. She had grown up 2 neighborhoods over, in a house with thin walls and a mother who worked double shifts at a diner. She remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be looked through instead of looked at. Now she held one of the most respected seats on the county bench, but almost nobody recognized her outside the courtroom. She preferred it that way. She had come to Millbrook Heights that morning because for 3 straight months, complaints had piled up on her desk, an unusual number for one small district, all describing the same pattern. Officers stopping people without cause. Officers escalating for no reason. Officers who seemed to believe the rules did not apply to them here. She wanted to see it herself before she trusted a single page of paperwork. No entourage, no badge on her belt, no bailiff trailing behind her. Just her own eyes and her own 2 feet on the pavement, the way she always preferred to learn the truth of a place before she judged it from behind a bench. A boy on a bicycle waved at her as he passed, and she waved back, smiling for the first time that morning. She stopped for a while outside a corner grocery, listening to an older woman named Ruth complain about how patrol cars now circled the block twice an hour, slowing near anyone standing too long on the sidewalk. Ruth didn't know the visitor's name, only that she listened carefully and wrote things down without judgment, and that was enough to earn her trust. Amara asked about specific dates, specific badge numbers if anyone remembered them, and Ruth shook her head, saying nobody bothered writing those things down anymore because nothing ever came of it. Amara thanked her, tucked the notepad back into her bag, and continued walking, the weight of dozens of similar stories settling quietly behind her calm expression. She had almost reached the end of the block, near the old laundromat with the flickering sign, when she heard it, a siren, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a blade. The patrol car rolled up fast, tires chirping against the curb, and the door swung open before the engine had fully stopped. Officer Daniel Carter stepped out, 38 years old, broad-shouldered, sunglasses pushed up on his head, despite the overcast sky. He had a reputation in the department for closing cases fast and asking few questions, the kind of officer captains loved to put on posters and community members learned to fear. He crossed the sidewalk in 4 strides and planted himself in front of Amara before she had even turned around fully. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said, though it wasn't really a question. Amara reached calmly into her tote bag, her expression unreadable, and produced a small wallet. Carter barely glanced at the card inside before tossing out another question, his tone already sliding toward accusation. "What are you doing walking around here with a bag like that? We've had reports of theft in this area." Amara answered evenly. She explained she was doing outreach work, gathering information from residents. Carter's eyes narrowed, unconvinced, or perhaps simply uninterested in being convinced. A small crowd began to gather the way crowds always do, drawn by raised voices and flashing lights, phones lifting out of pockets almost in unison. His partner, a younger officer named Brian Hess, leaned against the patrol car with his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the detached amusement of someone who had seen this pattern play out before and expected nothing different this time. Carter kept glancing toward the growing crowd, and something about the audience seemed to sharpen his tone rather than soften it, as though their presence gave him permission rather than pause. He asked Amara where she lived, how long she had been in the neighborhood, whether she had any outstanding warrants, firing the questions faster than she could answer any of them fully. She answered each one anyway, calmly, without raising her voice, without breaking eye contact. "Empty the bag," Carter ordered. Amara complied without protest, laying out a notepad, a pen, a bottle of water, nothing that resembled evidence of anything. Carter's jaw tightened, as though her calm cooperation offended him more than resistance would have. He circled her once, studying her hair, a thick, dark wig that had shifted slightly during the encounter. "That's fake," he said, almost triumphant, reaching toward her head. Amara stepped back, voice steady, but firm. "Officer, that is not necessary." He ignored her. "People hide things under wigs all the time," Carter announced to the gathering crowd, as if delivering evidence in a trial of his own invention. "Drugs, weapons. You'd be surprised." Amara told him plainly that there was nothing hidden beneath it, that he had no cause to touch her, no warrant, no reasonable suspicion beyond his own imagination. He didn't care. He radioed for backup, requesting equipment most people would never expect to hear requested on a public street. Within 10 minutes, a second officer arrived, carrying a black case. Inside it was a pair of clippers. The crowd swelled larger, phones rising higher, murmurs turning into gasps. Carter grabbed the edge of the wig and yanked it away, revealing Amara's natural hair beneath, cropped short and neat. It made no difference to him. "Just to be sure," he said, motioning for the clippers. Amara's voice rose only slightly, still remarkably controlled given the moment. "You do not have the authority to do this. I am asking you to stop." Carter smiled, the kind of smile that comes from a man who has never once faced consequences for anything in his life. "Relax," he said. "It'll grow back." He forced her down, one hand pressing on her shoulder, and switched on the clippers himself, right there in the open square, in full view of neighbors, children, a delivery driver who had stopped his truck to watch, and the second officer who filmed with visible amusement. Strand by strand, her hair fell to the pavement. Someone in the crowd let out a nervous laugh, quickly joined by others, the kind of laughter that spreads not because something is funny, but because people don't know what else to do with their fear. A few voices called out for him to stop, but a sharp look from Carter's partner silenced them just as quickly. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, covering the child's eyes with one hand while still watching herself, unable to look away entirely. An elderly man leaning on a cane took a single step forward before his son grabbed his arm and shook his head, warning him silently against the risk. The delivery driver lowered his phone once, thought better of putting it away, and raised it again, filming the rest in silence. Nobody intervened, not because they didn't want to, because every single person present understood in that moment exactly what could happen to them if they tried. When it was over, Carter stood back, admiring his work with a satisfaction that made the surrounding silence feel even heavier. "There," he said, loud enough for the phones to catch every word. "Now you look like what you really are." He laughed, glancing at his partner as if expecting applause. Amara said nothing. She knelt slowly, gathering the fallen strands of her own hair from the pavement into her palm, one lock at a time, with a steadiness that unsettled everyone, watching more than any scream could have. She did not look away from him. She did not look down in shame. She simply rose, brushed the dust from her knees, and locked eyes with Carter one final time. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it, yet somehow it carried across the entire square. "I hope tomorrow morning you still have the courage to look at me." Then she turned and walked away, her head bare, her back straight, leaving behind a crowd that didn't yet understand what they had just witnessed. Among the onlookers stood a young reporter named Rachel Doyle, notebook forgotten in her bag, phone still recording, though her hands had begun to shake. She had covered plenty of ugly things in this city. Evictions, protests, the occasional shouting match outside City Hall. But something about this felt different, wrong in a way she couldn't yet articulate. It wasn't the cruelty alone. It was the woman's composure. People who are truly powerless rarely look that unshaken. People who are afraid rarely ask for names. And Amara had asked. Calmly, deliberately, she had turned to each officer at the scene, one by one, and asked for their name and badge number. Carter had given his without hesitation, chest puffed with pride, certain there would never be consequences for a woman who had no way to fight back. His partner did the same, smirking the entire time, treating the request as a joke rather than a warning. Neither of them noticed that Rachel had captured every word, every syllable, saved quietly to her phone before anyone thought to stop her. Rachel watched Amara disappear around the corner, moving with a purpose that felt entirely mismatched to what had just happened to her. There was no defeat in that walk. There was something closer to resolve. Rachel told herself she would follow up later, ask around, try to learn the woman's name, but for now she simply stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, replaying the moment in her mind, unable to shake the feeling that this story was far from finished. She turned to the man standing beside her, an older resident who had watched the entire encounter without saying a word, and asked quietly whether he had ever seen the woman before. He shook his head slowly, still staring at the spot where the hair lay scattered across the pavement. Never, he said. But I've seen plenty of women treated like that around here. Nobody ever asks their names back, though. Not like she did. Rachel wrote the line down, unsure yet why it mattered, only certain that it did. A few blocks away, out of sight of the crowd, Amara stopped beside a quiet bus shelter and pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when the call connected, was flat and businesslike, betraying nothing of what had just happened to her body only minutes before. "It's me," she said. "Tomorrow morning, move case file 247 to the top of the docket. First thing." She listened for a moment, then added only one more line before hanging up. "Trust me. It's important." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking, her bare scalp catching the gray afternoon light, her expression unreadable to anyone who might have passed her on the street. By the time the sun set that evening, the video had already begun circulating through phones and group chats across the city, though not in the direction anyone might have expected. Somehow the framing had shifted entirely, twisted by the very officers who had filmed it. Clips appeared, showing only the aftermath, Amara standing bald and silent, without context, without the demand for identification that started it all, without the moment Carter reached for clippers unprompted. Comments beneath the footage assumed she must have done something to deserve it. "People are not usually shaved in public for nothing," several messages read. "Must be a repeat offender." Officer Carter was doing his job. Officer Carter, for his part, seemed almost delighted by the attention. He agreed to an interview with a local news outlet the following morning, standing tall in his uniform, chin lifted, describing the encounter as a matter of following proper procedure to the letter. "I did what any officer would do to protect this community," he said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence of a man who had never once imagined being questioned. "You have to be thorough. You have to be careful. People don't always look like what they are." He smiled at the end of the sentence, as though repeating his earlier cruelty was itself a kind of victory lap. Colleagues at the precinct slapped him on the back that morning, a few even joking that he ought to frame the clip for his locker. Officer Hess told anyone who would listen that Carter had simply been thorough, that in this line of work, hesitation gets people hurt, that the woman should have simply cooperated from the start instead of causing a scene. Nobody in the department seemed to question why cooperation had required clippers. Nobody asked what crime, exactly, had ever been established. The story, as far as most of the precinct was concerned, was already closed, filed away as one more example of a job well done. Captain Helen Morris watched the segment from her office with a growing unease she couldn't quite name. Something about the footage bothered her, the calm in the woman's face, the way she had asked for names and badge numbers instead of pleading or fleeing. In 20 years on the force, Morris had learned to trust her instincts about trouble long before it fully arrived, and every instinct she had was telling her that this was far from over. She picked up the phone and called the records department, asking quietly, almost reluctantly, whether anyone had managed to identify the woman in the video. The answer that came back was a simple, unsettling no. She replayed the clip twice more after hanging up, pausing on the moment the woman rose from her knees, studying the way her shoulders squared instead of slumped. Morris had seen fear plenty of times in her career, and she had seen anger just as often, but this was neither. It looked, if anything, like patience, the kind of patience that belongs to someone who already knows how a story will end before it finishes unfolding. She closed the laptop, rubbed her eyes, and told her assistant to pull every incident report filed in Millbrook Heights over the past 6 months, unable to shake the sense that the department had just made a mistake far larger than anyone yet understood. Across town, in the clerk's office of the county courthouse, a young woman named Denise Okafor sat at her desk scrolling through her phone during a break, half paying attention until the video loaded fully, and her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the face immediately, despite the missing hair, despite the wig that had been ripped away in the footage. She had seen that exact face just days earlier, seated behind a bench, delivering a sentencing with the same unshaken calm, now playing out on her screen in an entirely different context. Denise's coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered against the tile floor, coffee spreading in a dark stain she barely noticed. She sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the frozen frame on her phone, before whispering the name aloud to no one in particular. "That's Judge Brooks." She said it again, louder this time, as if hearing it out loud might make it less impossible. Around her, coworkers glanced up, puzzled by her sudden stillness, unaware that the ground beneath the entire department was about to shift. Within the hour, word had reached the chief judge's office, spreading through hushed phone calls and wide-eyed whispers down every hallway of the courthouse. Nobody wanted to believe it at first. Judge Amara Brooks was known throughout the county for her precision, her discipline, her refusal to tolerate misconduct of any kind inside her courtroom. The idea that she had been the woman in that video, kneeling on a public sidewalk while her hair was stripped away by an officer laughing at his own cruelty, felt almost too absurd to process. And yet the resemblance was undeniable, confirmed within minutes by 3 separate members of the courthouse staff. The chief judge, a soft-spoken man named Robert Ellison, called Amara's chambers directly, half expecting the call to go unanswered, half hoping it would. When she picked up on the second ring, her voice as calm and composed as it always was in every prior conversation they had shared, he found himself struggling to form the question at all. "Amara," he finally said, "is it true?" She didn't ask what he meant. She simply answered, "Yes, Robert, it's true." A long silence followed on the line before he finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic on behalf of an entire system that had failed her in broad daylight. The police department's phone lines lit up almost immediately once local reporters began connecting the dots, calls stacking one after another, until the front desk simply stopped answering. Captain Morris felt the color drain from her face when her assistant burst into her office without knocking, phone in hand, voice trembling as she relayed what she'd just learned. Morris sat in silence for a long moment, running through the entire encounter in her mind, understanding with sickening clarity just how badly her department had misjudged the situation. She thought of Carter's confident interview from that very morning and felt something cold settle in her stomach. When someone finally reached Carter to warn him, he laughed it off entirely, certain it was some kind of prank designed to rattle him. "No way," he said, shaking his head at his partner over lunch. If she was really a judge, why was she walking around in torn jeans with no security? That doesn't make sense. He genuinely believed his own logic, convinced that power always announces itself, that authority always travels with an entourage. He had no framework for understanding a woman who preferred to walk unnoticed through the very neighborhoods she was sworn to protect, gathering truth with her own eyes, rather than trusting it secondhand. By nightfall, however, Doubt had begun to creep even into Carter's certainty, fed by the sheer volume of calls flooding the department and the increasingly pale expression on Captain Morris's face each time she passed him in the hallway. Then, just after 10 in the evening, an official summons arrived, delivered by courier directly to the department, ordering every officer involved in the incident to appear before the court first thing the following morning. The order carried the seal of the county judiciary itself, and beneath the formal language sat one line that made even the most confident officers in the room fall silent. It was signed personally by Judge Amara Brooks. By 7 the next morning, the courthouse steps were already crowded, a dense knot of reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers pressing against the barricades set up by uniformed officers who looked distinctly uncomfortable in their new assignment. Word had spread overnight through every channel imaginable, and by sunrise the entire city seemed to know that something extraordinary was about to unfold inside Courtroom 4. Inside, the public gallery filled to capacity. Within minutes of the doors opening, every seat claimed, people standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, despite the bailiff's repeated requests to maintain order. Officer Carter arrived in his dress uniform, freshly pressed, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling calm confidence, though his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching at his sides as he walked the long hallway toward the courtroom. He told himself, over and over, that he had done nothing wrong, that procedure was procedure, that even judges were not above the law when their identity remained unconfirmed at the moment of an encounter. He rehearsed the thought until it felt almost true. Even if she is a judge, he told himself, I still followed protocol. I still did my job. He took his seat beside his attorney, glancing around at the packed gallery, at Rachel Doyle seated near the front with her notebook open, at Captain Morris standing rigid near the side door, her face unreadable. Somewhere behind him, Denise Okafor watched from the clerk's station, still shaken from the day before. The room buzzed, with a tension that seemed to hum through the walls themselves. Everyone waiting, everyone holding their breath for the moment the doors at the front of the courtroom would finally open. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Reed, stepped forward and called the room to order in a voice that cracked slightly under the weight of the moment. Every head turned toward the front. Every conversation died at once. The heavy wooden door beside the bench creaked open, and the room rose to its feet in a single unified motion, chairs scraping against the floor in a wave of sound that rippled from the front rows to the back. Amara Brooks stepped through the doorway, and for a moment nobody moved at all. Her scalp was bare, still faintly red in places from the clippers. No wig, no scarf, nothing to soften the sight of what had been done to her less than 24 hours earlier. She wore her black judicial robe, the fabric falling in clean, familiar lines around her shoulders, and she carried herself with the same unhurried composure she had shown on that sidewalk the day before. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of her robe as she crossed toward the bench. Somewhere in the second row, Ruth from the corner grocery sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, having recognized the woman's photograph from the morning news and made the trip downtown without telling anyone why. She had not expected to see her again so soon, and certainly not like this, standing before an entire courtroom with the very marks of yesterday's cruelty still visible for everyone to witness. Ruth's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother wiping away, and beside her, a stranger reached over and gently squeezed her hand, neither of them needing to explain why the moment felt so heavy. Officer Carter's face drained of color the instant he saw her. Whatever fragile confidence he had built overnight collapsed in an instant, replaced by something closer to genuine fear. He had told himself repeatedly that this couldn't be real, that some mistake had been made. But there was no mistaking the woman standing before him now, the same eyes, the same voice he remembered, issuing sentences from behind that very bench on cases he had testified in before. She did not look at him directly. She simply took her seat, folded her hands, and let the silence stretch long enough for everyone in the room to fully absorb what they were witnessing. Amara began speaking before anyone else could, her voice calm, measured, carrying easily to every corner of the courtroom without need for volume. She announced immediately that she would not personally preside over the matter involving her own encounter, citing an obvious conflict of interest that no honest observer could dispute. Instead, she explained a colleague, Judge Walter Simmons, would assume responsibility for the proceedings, ensuring the process remained beyond reproach from its very first moment. A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery, many having assumed she intended to judge her own case, to claim some form of personal vengeance from the very seat of power that had eluded her the day before. Judge Simmons entered moments later and took the bench, formally opening the proceedings with the practiced efficiency of a man determined to handle the matter with absolute rigor. District Attorney Kevin Ross rose first, laying out the sequence of events with methodical precision, describing an unlawful stop, an unjustified search, and an act of deliberate humiliation carried out against a private citizen with no criminal history and no basis for suspicion whatsoever. Defense attorney Linda Hayes rose in response, attempting to frame Carter's actions as an honest, if regrettable, application of standard procedure under uncertain circumstances. The first video was played for the courtroom, the footage captured by Rachel Doyle from the edge of the crowd, clear enough to remove any ambiguity about what had transpired. Every eye in the room watched the screen as Carter's voice rang out through the speakers, demanding identification, dismissing Amara's calm explanations, ordering the clippers brought to the scene. Ross paused the footage at key moments, asking pointed questions about department policy, about the specific legal justification required before an officer could compel such an act against a civilian. Carter's attorney objected repeatedly, but the questions landed regardless, each one chipping further away at any defense that remained. Ross called Rachel Doyle to the stand next, and she described what she had witnessed with the precision of someone who had replayed the footage 100 times since recording it. She recounted the laughter in the crowd, the way it had died the moment Amara spoke her final words on that sidewalk, the strange stillness that had followed her all the way home that night. Linda Hayes attempted a brief cross-examination, suggesting the reporter might have selectively edited her footage to favor a particular narrative, but Rachel calmly offered to submit the full, unedited recording from her device, and the objection lost its force almost immediately. Captain Morris was called to testify, and she answered honestly, though visibly reluctant to do so, confirming under oath that no policy within the department authorized what had occurred on that sidewalk. There was no warrant on file. There was no documented cause for search. There was no protocol anywhere in the department's manual that permitted an officer to physically alter a civilian's appearance as a means of establishing identity. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes avoided Carter's entirely as she spoke, the weight of institutional failure settling visibly onto her shoulders with every answer she gave. Just as the morning session seemed ready to break for recess, Ross rose again, announcing that a second piece of evidence had come to light overnight, footage recovered from an officer's body-worn camera that had somehow been left running throughout the entire encounter. The gallery stirred immediately, sensing that something significant was about to change the entire trajectory of the case. Judge Simmons ordered the footage prepared for immediate viewing, and within minutes, the courtroom fell into a silence even heavier than before. The body camera footage told a far uglier story than the version circulating online the previous day. It captured Carter turning to his partner before the clippers were even retrieved, grinning as he said, loud enough for the microphone to catch clearly, that they should teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. His partner laughed in response, suggesting they let her remember this for the rest of her life. The footage showed no hesitation, no genuine concern about identity or danger, only casual, almost gleeful cruelty passed between two men who never once considered they might face consequences. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the footage played, several spectators covering their mouths, a few rising halfway from their seats before catching themselves. Even Linda Hayes, seated beside her client, allowed a visible flicker of dismay to cross her face, the practiced neutrality of a defense attorney momentarily slipping. Captain Morris closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the full weight of what her department had allowed to happen, understanding now that this went far beyond a single officer's poor judgment. District Attorney Ross turned to face the bench directly, his voice hardening with each word, stating plainly that the evidence now on record left no room for interpretation, no defensive procedure, no claim of reasonable uncertainty. This was not a mistake made under pressure, he argued. This was cruelty chosen deliberately, performed for an audience, treated as entertainment by the very officers sworn to protect the public. He requested that criminal charges be pursued immediately, citing unlawful detention, assault, and civil rights violations carried out under color of authority. Judge Simmons called a brief recess to allow both sides time to prepare closing arguments, but the outcome already felt settled to nearly everyone in the room. Carter sat motionless in his chair, staring at the table in front of him, the confident posture from that morning entirely gone. Linda Hayes leaned over and spoke to him quietly during the recess, and though nobody could hear what passed between them, his shoulders sank lower with every word she said, as though even his own attorney had run out of angles left to argue. When the recess ended and proceedings resumed, he asked, quietly, almost desperately, if he might address Amara directly, if he could offer some form of apology before the final ruling came down. Judge Simmons allowed it, though he cautioned Carter that his words would be entered into the record regardless of their content. Carter turned toward the gallery, toward the woman seated near the front, whose bare scalp still bore faint marks from his own hands the day before, and he began to speak, his voice cracking halfway through the first sentence. He said he hadn't known who she was, that if he had known, everything would have been different, that he was sorry for the position his mistake had placed everyone in. Amara listened without interrupting, her expression calm, almost gentle, until he finished. Then she rose slightly from her seat, though she remained silent for a long moment before responding. "You didn't humiliate a judge," she said finally, her voice, carrying clearly across the courtroom, steady and unhurried. "You humiliated a citizen. I only happened to be the one standing in front of you that day." The room absorbed her words in complete silence before a low murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery, several spectators nodding, a few wiping at their eyes. Carter opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his career, that his failure had never been about recognizing her title. It had been about failing to recognize her humanity. The gallery began to applaud, softly at first, then louder, until Judge Simmons was forced to call for order, though even he seemed reluctant to silence it too quickly. When the ruling came down later that afternoon, it arrived swiftly and without ambiguity. Carter was found to have violated multiple statutes, his actions deemed a clear abuse of authority carried out with willful disregard for the rights of the citizen before him. Bailiff Marcus Reed stepped forward at the judge's direction, and the courtroom watched, in near total silence, as handcuffs closed around Carter's wrists, right there at the defense table. The same hands that had once held the clippers, now bound behind his back. Reporters surged toward the courthouse doors the moment proceedings adjourned, cameras flashing in rapid bursts as Amara emerged onto the front steps, her robe replaced now by a simple gray coat, her bare head held high beneath the midday sun. Questions came at her from every direction, voices overlapping, microphones jostling for position, but she moved through the chaos with the same unshaken calm that had carried her through the entire ordeal from the very beginning. Rachel Doyle managed to catch her eye briefly near the bottom of the steps, and Amara offered her the faintest nod of acknowledgement before continuing on, declining every request for a formal statement. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the borders of the city, prompting scrutiny that reached well past Officer Carter's individual case. Investigators began combing through years of prior complaints against the department, many of which had been dismissed or buried entirely under previous leadership, revealing a troubling pattern of unchecked aggression toward residents in exactly the kind of neighborhood Amara had been visiting that morning. 2 additional officers were placed on administrative leave within the week, their conduct in unrelated incidents suddenly drawing fresh attention now that the public was finally watching closely. One case involved a teenager stopped 3 separate times in a single month for reasons never documented in any official report. Another involved a delivery worker detained for over an hour without cause, released only after his employer arrived to vouch for him personally. Neither case had drawn any attention before. Both now sat under active review, reopened by investigators who finally had reason to look twice, their files pulled from storage boxes that had gone untouched for the better part of a year. Captain Morris, to her credit, did not attempt to deflect responsibility, once the full scope of the department's failures became clear. She ordered an immediate overhaul of training procedures, mandated new oversight requirements for any interaction involving search or seizure, and personally reviewed every complaint filed against her officers over the previous 3 years. It was not enough to undo the harm already done, she admitted publicly, but it was the only honest place to begin. Change, she said, had to start with the people willing to admit how badly things had gone wrong. She met with Ruth and several other residents from Millbrook Heights personally, sitting in the back room of the same corner grocery where Amara had once stopped to listen, taking notes of her own this time, instead of simply issuing statements to the press. Some residents remained skeptical, having heard similar promises before that dissolved the moment public attention moved elsewhere. Morris didn't argue with their doubt. She simply told them she intended to keep showing up until the doubt wore thin, and to their quiet surprise, she did exactly that, returning to the neighborhood every few weeks long after the cameras had stopped following her. Weeks later, Amara appeared at a civic forum on community trust and accountability, her hair still short, still growing back in patches, though she made no effort to hide it beneath a wig or scarf this time. She stood before the audience with the same quiet composure that had carried her through every moment since that afternoon on the sidewalk, and when she finally spoke, the room fell into the same reverent silence that had gripped the courtroom weeks before. She did not dwell on what had happened to her personally. She spoke instead about the countless people who endure similar treatment every single day without cameras, without courtrooms, without anyone ever learning their names. She spoke of Ruth from the corner grocery, of the boy on the bicycle, of the dozens of residents who had shared their stories with her that morning before everything changed, none of whom had ever expected their complaints to matter to anyone in a position to act on them. She reminded the room that her own case had only reached a courtroom because of an accident of circumstance, because a reporter happened to be standing at the right corner with a phone already raised, because a clerk happened to recognize a face beneath a shaved scalp. Most people, she said, are never granted that kind of accident. Most people simply carry the weight and move on, unheard. Dignity isn't measured by what was taken from you, she said, her voice steady, carrying easily to the back rows, without need for amplification. It's measured by what we refuse to let happen to someone else. A long moment of silence followed before the applause began, rising slowly at first, then swelling until the entire room stood together, hands raised, voices joining in something that felt less like celebration and more like recognition, an acknowledgement shared collectively of everything that moment had come to represent. Amara offered a small, tired smile, the first genuine one anyone had seen from her since the ordeal began, and then she stepped back from the podium, allowing the room to hold its own silence for a while longer. Outside, the afternoon light stretched long across the courthouse steps where it had all first ended weeks earlier, the same steps where cameras had once surged forward to capture her walking free. The city moved on around her, buses rumbling past, pedestrians hurrying along their routines, unaware or indifferent to the quiet weight still resting in that particular stretch of sidewalk. Ruth waited near the bottom of the steps that afternoon, and when Amara finally noticed her in the thinning crowd, she crossed the sidewalk without hesitation and took the older woman's hands in both of her own. Neither of them said very much. Ruth simply thanked her for listening that morning weeks earlier, for writing things down when nobody else ever had, and Amara told her, quietly, that she intended to keep listening long after the story stopped making headlines. It was a small exchange, unnoticed by the departing reporters, but it lingered longer in the minds of those who happened to witness it than almost anything said inside the courtroom that day. Those who had been there, who had watched a woman kneel to gather her own fallen hair without a single tear, understood that something in the city had shifted permanently. Even if most people would never be able to name exactly what it was, no one stands above the law, and no one is too small to be protected by it.